It's hard to believe that I've been in this new garage space for about 2 years now, and one of the last remaining things that I wanted to change was this alcove. The previous installed cabinets were just too big. They were really tall, really deep, great for long-term storage if this were just a garage, but for woodworking it just wasn't appropriate. I need easy access to things. So this is what I came up with. Let me give you the tour. In the right bank of cabinets, I've got some double doors, and as you can see, a whole bunch of trays. In some cases, for storing some things, I prefer a shallow tray over a drawer because it's actually easier to get to things. The left bank of cabinets is a little more complicated, but pretty easy to make still. I've got a bunch of drawers here. Now these are deeper, but not too deep like the built-ins I had before. When they get this deep, suddenly the drawer is just not as useful to me. But everything's on full extension slides, so it comes all the way out. Now over here, I've got some adjustable shelving, and you can see I've got some sustainers in there, as well as these Stanley organizers, and the cabinet's deep enough that this actually is 2 levels deep, so there are 4 of these containers and 4 sustainers in this space. And while not directly related to the cabinets, the space between here is sized so that I could put my drill press there, or my original plan was to just put a garbage can in there. Now, I'll give you guys a plan for this, but ultimately the measurements here are just appropriate for my space. So make sure that you look at those numbers and make sure they make sense for your space. Ultimately, I want you to see the techniques that are used and the methodology to build these cabinets, and then you could apply that to any size, dimension cabinet that you want to build for your shop. All right, let's get into it. With the old cabinets ripped out, I can start building a flat level platform for each cabinet. I want the platforms to be at least 3 inches tall to create a reasonable toe kick, so I set up a laser so that it's 3 inches on the high side of the slope. Measuring over about 4 feet, I can see what the height will be at the end of the first cabinet. Turns out it's 4 inches, so that tells me that the right platform has to taper a full inch over a length of 4 feet. I repeat this process for the other cabinet. Now this one will start at 4 1/4 and end up at 5 1/4. The platforms will be made from tapered 2x6s. I first cut them to length, and the tapers will be based on my measurements. The short support pieces are then cut to length, and the width is taken directly from the tapered pieces. I'll use screws to secure the frames together. Because of the taper, there's a little extra material sitting proud of the surface, and I'll quickly knock that down with a block plane. Now I'll drop the frames in place and check for level in both directions. I could then use shims to get the bubble where it needs to be. Since we're trying to level in 2 directions, it could be a little fussy, and I'm probably being more picky than I need to be, but I'm here, I'm doing the work, I may as well make it as good as it can be. Once leveled, I can attach a piece of OSB. I want the platforms to be stable, but I don't necessarily want to drill into the concrete. So I'll take each shim out and reinsert it with some liquid nails on both sides. Like many marriages, this is a stable but not necessarily permanent connection. At this point, the kids discovered the 2 custom performance stages I apparently built for them. Now let's get to the cabinets. I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch. This stuff is pretty heavy, so I find it easiest to cut the parts down on the ground with a few styrofoam insulation boards for support. For the cabinet sides, try to find at least 1 square corner. The square sides are then put against the fence to cut the panel to its final dimension. The support cleats are also cut at this time. These will span across the side panels, bringing the whole structure together without the need for full back panels or bottom panels. Next, I need to cut 4 shallow notches and a large notch for the concrete wall into each side panel, and I'll do that at the bandsaw. Using the fence in conjunction with a magnet as a stop, it's pretty easy to cut the notches systematically and accurately. The finished panels should look something like this. Now we'll cut the dados into cleats. I'll install my dado blade and bury it partially inside a sacrificial fence. The amount of dado protruding from the fence should be the same as the thickness of the plywood. The height should be set so that it leaves a 1/2 inch of material on the cleat. When the cut is perfect, the cleat will set into the notch so that it's perfectly flush. All of the cleats will receive the rabbet on the end. We have dados to cut in the middle of the cleats, and it's just a matter of lining up the pencil lines with the dado stack and making the cut. By the way, when cutting dados like this, it's best not to bring the work back over the spinning blade. If anything shifts, you'll widen your dado, or worse, cause it to kick back. To locate the screw holes, I pre-drill from the inside of the dado where it's really easy to find the center. On the other face, I can then use my countersink and pre-drill for screws. Assembly goes quickly. I use clamps to help hold the sides up, and I can then drop the cleats in one at a time and attach them with glue and screws. Before adding the glue, I pre-drill into the panel to help prevent splitting. Then I can slather on the glue and drive home the screws. I could just keep flipping the case, adding the cleats as I go. The bigger of the two cases actually has 4 side panels, but the assembly process is the same. And here comes my helper. I think most woodworking parents can relate to having a kid running around the shop in their diaper. Well, I may as well put her to work. And just like that, both cases are constructed. Now let's measure for our drawers and sliding trays. The drawer boxes and trays will be an inch narrower than the size of the opening. The left cabinet will have a bunch of drawers, and the right will feature shallow trays and a set of doors. That's a lot of small parts, so let's get cutting. With the dado blade and the sacrificial fence, I can cut rabbets in the drawer and tray sides. That's the fit we're looking for. The bottom panels will be made from 1/4-inch ply, so I'll use a dado stack to cut the perfect groove. 1/4-inch plywood is never a 1/4-inch, so I'll need to use shims in the dado stack to get a nice snug fit. Next, I'll measure for the bottom panels. I take the inner dimensions and add 3/4 of an inch since the grooves are 3/8 of an inch deep. Now we can assemble. I insert the bottom panel into one of the sides, then add the front and back pieces. I'm using brad nails to help hold things together, just until the glue dries. That's an old Norm joke. Each drawer is pre-drilled and screwed together to reinforce the rabbet. Well, that's one. Many more to go. And the trays, although smaller, are assembled the same way. Now we can install the slides. I like to mount slides flush with the bottom of the drawers. That makes it easy to mount on both the drawer and the cabinet. For the drawer, I work on a flat surface and use a piece of scrap as a stop at the front. I could then extend the drawer portion of the slide and drive a few screws to secure it in place. Now I can remove the cabinet side of the slide and drive the remainder of the screws. No measuring, no marking, just good old dummy proofing. These particular slides are from Accuride and are sold as low-profile slides. That just means that they aren't quite as wide, but they're still a 1/2 inch thick like most others. Installing them on the trays is exactly the same process. Now that's a gaggle of drawers, or maybe a herd, or possibly a murder. Who knows, it's a lot of drawers. Now let's install the cabinet side of the slides. In my plan, I decided where I want the bottom of each drawer box. Then I cut some spacers for a repeatable way to index each slide. The slide just sits on top of the plywood spacers with the front of the slide about 1/16 of an inch back from the edge. Once the top slide is attached, I can take the top spacer off and attach the next slide. The bottom slide is mounted 1/4 inch up from the bottom. Also notice how I have to use a shorter slide here because of my concrete situation. Now I just have to repeat that on the other side and twice again for the right cabinet. And this is the part where I think maybe I should tape these together or use thicker stock, but I persevere. Even if the fit is perfect, the drawer is always a little bit rough the first time you insert it. But once you push it in all the way, it'll slide in and out very easily. And most of you who know my sense of humor know how hard I'm fighting my instincts right now to make a joke about this, but I won't. Must be mature. Oops, my helper's back. Okay, my mind's out of the gutter now. This is the point where I start getting excited about all of these new storage opportunities as they become a reality. It's probably a good time to attach the cabinets to the bases, just a few screws into the bottom cleats, and a few into the wall. The rightmost compartment of the left cabinet will feature adjustable shelves. I'll use Rockler's shelf pin jig to get the job done. I've had this jig for over 10 years now, and it has never let me down. Just line it up, hold it in place, and drill. Before building the doors, let's look at the hinges. Most European cup hinges result in a door that protrudes into the opening. That means it would be in the way of any trays, and we'd have to mount the slides for those trays on cleats in order to avoid a collision. Thankfully, I found these sweet zero protrusion hinges that put the door outside of the tray's path. And just as a bonus, they kind of look like a metal cricket. Before we can do anything with the hinges, we'll need some doors. Sorry about the bird flip there. Unless you're the person that thumbs down my videos just seconds after it's posted, in that case, take it at face value. The rails and stiles are then milled to size. The panels will be 1/4-inch plywood, so I'll cut a groove in all the pieces at the table saw. 2 passes, flipping the workpiece in between, will result in a perfectly centered groove of the exact width. I'll use the domino to knock out the frame joinery. To make assembly easier, I'll pre-glue the tenons into the rails. The inside and outside perimeters of the door will have a nice little chamfer. The rails get the chamfer all the way across the inside edge, but the stiles have to stop before the end. Otherwise, we'll have a chamfer where 2 pieces meet, which would look really weird. The panels are cut from some 1/4-inch maple plywood. The assembly is pretty easy. Throw some glue in the mortises and smack everything together. After the glue is dry, I sand the entire frame and clean up the mill marks and level the joints as needed. Remember how we stopped short with the chamfers? Well, now's the time we have to finish those off with a chisel. To install the hinges, I mark the locations of the brackets. I'm not too picky about this, but I obviously have to navigate around those slides. Using the adjustable square allows me to lock in a setting and transfer that to the other side. Now here's a little jig that's preset for the hinge bracket. I just line it up with my center line and pre-drill with a self-centering bit. To get the hinges in the correct locations on the door, I'll clamp a piece of scrap to the bottom of the cabinet. I can then place the door on the scrap and transfer those center lines. Whenever doing detailed work like this, I always try to think of ways that will take the stupid human out of the equation. Oh, quick! Look busy! Here comes the boss. To drill for the cup side of the hinge, it's Rockler to the rescue again. This is another jig I've had for over 10 years now. Just line up the center line and drill. With the hinge in the hole, I square it up and then pre-drill for the screws. Now I can snap the hinge parts together. With the second door installed, I can see that I've got a little bit of contact in the middle, so I trim the doors down just a smidge at the table saw. That's much better. I originally planned on using solid alder for my drawer fronts, but the boards just aren't wide enough, so I'll opt for plywood trimmed with alder. The trim will be 3/4 inches square. This means the edging will be slightly proud of the surface when it's glued to 3/4 inch plywood. I start by gluing the long edging first. When the glue is dry, I sand the proud material flush, and then I could trim the fronts to length and attach the edging to the ends. After sanding the edging flush, I trim the overhangs at the table saw using this cool trick. A piece of scrap between the fence and the workpiece allows me to trim one side safely. Once one side is trimmed, I can trim the other side just using the fence as usual. The drawer fronts get the same chamfer as the doors. Now I can drill for the pulls by centering them on the drawer front. Always use a piece of scrap under your work when you're drilling because it really helps prevent tear out. To locate the drawer fronts, we'll employ another trick to make our lives easier. With another piece of scrap clamped to the bottom, I could stack the drawers with 1/16 inch shims as spacers between each one. If the drawer fronts are too big, now's the time to fix them. Using the holes we drilled, I drive a couple of panhead screws to temporarily attach the fronts. By the way, I definitely didn't invent this trick. It's something I read about years ago, but always seem to forget when I'm doing false fronts. Thanks to several folks on Instagram for the reminder. With the drawers removed, I could then countersink for screws and firmly attach the fronts from the inside. Now I can remove those panhead screws, drill through, and attach the hardware. The doors get the same hardware. Since there's only two, I just lay them out and install the boring way. Now let's work on the tops. I'm going to use 2 layers of 3/4 inch MDF as the core. With a whole bunch of glue smeared on the surface, I drop the second piece in place. Notice that the top piece falls short of the width. This is because I didn't want to buy additional sheets of MDF to satisfy the greater than 24-inch width. So I'll just put some filler strips in the back to take up the space, and no one will ever see this after the installation. I'll use the track saw to make a nice clean cut on the front and sides. To protect the edges of the top, I'll use 1.5 wide alder. The corners have to be mitered, so with one side cut, I could line it up and then mark the other side. Now I'll attach the pieces one by one. By the way, this is never a one-cut thing for me. I always have to sneak up on the fit and make multiple trips to the miter saw. 21 gauge brad nails will secure the edging. After flushing up the top surface, I'll add a little chamfer. This is also a good time to fill the nail holes. For the finish, I'm using Osmo Pollux. It's a pretty expensive finish, but I had some left over from another project, and using it in the shop gives me a great reference with regard to durability. I did 2 coats with a light sanding in between. I actually forgot to do this earlier. In the back, we need a couple of pocket hole screws to help secure the top. Now with the tops in place, I'll drive screws through the front cleat, as well as those pocket holes we just drilled. For the open cubby, I'll install 2 pieces of scrap to make the bottom more usable. For the adjustable shelves, I'll use some leftover MDF and put a little edging on the front. This is a minor detail, but see how I'm using a small cleat for this glue up? The cleat makes sure that all of the pressure is where we need it. If I didn't use the cleat, this type of clamp would put pressure on the top of that piece of trim, which would create a gap where the pieces actually meet. Worst part is, you probably wouldn't even notice this until you turn the thing over and the glue is dry. Now I can install all the hardware. I've got a lot of organizing to do, but for now, I'll install some power strips and my bit storage case, which we have plans for, by the way. And how about we do a little drawer organization while we're at it? Does this look familiar? I'm going to try to tame this mess using Rockler's new Lock-A-Line organizing system. The starter kit that they sell comes with quite a few components, but I'll need to use their wide tray pieces to fill out this wide drawer. The first row goes in easily. The second row will need to be cut. That's easy enough to do using the lines on the back as a guide. If you cut along the line, everything just lines up perfectly. So now I can put my stuff back in, utilizing the dividers and the little trays that they include in the kit. And perhaps the best part, you can just pull the components up and change things around if you need to. Ah, now that tickles me in a special place. Now, it may seem like it's a lot of effort to put into shop cabinets and things like that, but ultimately, I spend a lot of time in here. This is not only the place where I make money, it's my refuge. It's where I take a break. I love my family, but sometimes I need a little bit of time off, and I spend most of my time in here alone. This is my fun place. So I want things to look nice. I want them to be functional, and I want my time in this space to be efficient and fun. All right, so hopefully you'll take the time to build your own shop cabinets using some of these techniques. We'll see you next time.